Today we are going to be reading from chapter 14 of A Day of Rest by Edna Creekmore Carman. Oh, and here's the picture that goes with that chapter. We're outside because Susan is outside. In stunned silence, Susan stood behind the bushes and watched as the mules pulling the wagon clomped their way down the incline from the mine entrance and then around the foot of the hill before disappearing out of sight behind the tall trees. As the last corner of the wagon bed vanished behind the trees, the young girls swung around and stared in horror at the empty valley. Bert and Jim were gone. She was alone. Susan's throat tightened. Oh! Susan's face screwed up as she began to cry, softly at first and then louder and louder. She didn't care if the men in the wagon did hear her and come back. She had rather go with them than to be left alone in the forest with the rats and the animals. Susan even started down the incline of the road on which the wagon had disappeared, but stopped after only a few steps. Bert would scold her something awful if she followed the wagon. He had told her to go back home. But she didn't want to go home alone. For a while, Susan howled out her misery. Then gradually the flow of tears stopped. Susan wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and tried to remember what Bert had said. First of all, Bert had said that she was to follow the stream back to the frog pond. Hesitantly, Susan walked over to the mine entrance with its heap of gray shale. Then, boldly disregarding her new dress, Susan sat down on the bank of shale and slid, landing with her feet in the miry silt of the drainage pool. Taking no time to contemplate the sludge or the scum, Susan sloshed through the water to the other side, where, without stopping, she headed for the clear stream beyond. When she reached the clear stream, Susan began wading against the current back up the valley. As the clear, sparkling water washed away the black scum from her legs, Susan began to feel better. Birds were singing in the bright sunlight. Butterflies floated in the gentle breeze. A large black and yellow butterfly lit on a bunch of ironweed right by the stream. Susan stopped for a moment and watched as the butterfly uncurled its long tongue. She wished Bert could see that beautiful butterfly, but he couldn't. Bert was tied up in the wagon. Tears flooded Susan's eyes, but she determinedly wiped them away. She had to get home to tell Dad what had happened to Bert and Jim. Dad would get the boys back. Splash, splash. Susan waded doggedly through the rippling water of the little stream. When she came to the frog pond, Susan paused. Which of the little streams entering the pond was the one she was supposed to follow? Bert had said, "Follow the stream to the right," but Susan was always confused which hand was right and which was left. Susan shook first one hand and then the other. Which one felt right? She just didn't know. Jim had said something else, something about the sun. Go toward the sun. Neither of the small streams that flowed into the pond came directly from the sun, but one was on the same side of the pond as the sun. Susan decided that stream must be the one she should follow. Wading in the stream while she climbed up the side of the hill was harder than it had been wading in the stream going downhill. The bushes tore at her hair. Her braids were caught, jerked, and pulled. Before long, the ribbons holding the ends of the braids together were jerked off and the braids were pulled apart. The hair fell forward into Susan's eyes. The mossy rocks in the bottom of the stream were slippery. With each step, her foot slid forward or backward, left or right. As her foot twisted on the mossy rocks, Susan fell on her knees. The dress had been a little wet from the time she slid into the drainage pool at the mine, but now the whole front of the skirt was wet. The wet skirt slapped against her, clung to her legs, and tripped her. After several falls, Susan tried to leave the stream, but it did not work. The saw briars tore at her legs and dress, and the thick undergrowth forced her farther and farther from the stream. She had to stick to the stream. She would get lost if she left it. Back in the stream, puffing and moaning, Susan climbed up through the swift, cool water to the point where the spring bubbled from the side of the hill. "Cut straight up the mountain from where the spring comes out," Bert had said. Susan started climbing and then stopped. The ridge of the mountain curved, forming a horseshoe. She could neither go straight ahead, to the left, or to the right, and still be going straight uphill. Which way should she go? How could she decide? It was more than Susan could endure. Susan slumped to the ground and dropped her head on her hands and gave herself the luxury of some unrestrained crying. However, the crying gave no relief. She had already cried too much without any response from anyone. Unless someone heard you, unless there was some reaction to your distress, some change in the situation, crying did no good. Susan turned and stared at the long sweeping ridge that formed the crest of the mountain. What should she do? Go toward the sun if you get lost. Where was the sun? Susan couldn't tell. Either the trees were so tall or the sun so low, but there were no sunny spots on the leafy forest floor or on the long, straight trunks of the trees. There were no individual shadows either. The whole forest was a shadow. In fact, now that she thought about the matter, it would soon be dark in the forest. Soon the night animals would come out and the wildcat would begin to howl. Susan shivered. Was that dark place under the brush hiding a cat that even now was sitting there watching her? Suppose there was something even worse than a wildcat there. Silently, Susan sat in the darkening forest, looking at every bush that moved, dreading the appearance of an animal. Any animal. Through the soft sighing of the wind in the treetops, Susan heard a sound so familiar that at first it did not reach her consciousness, a sound of rumbling like thunder, the sound of a heavy truck going uphill in gear. Susan jumped to her feet, turning swiftly in the direction of the sound. The rumbling of the truck was coming from beyond that hill, and that truck would pass right in front of her house. Briskly, Susan began scrambling up the side of the hill, heedless of bushes catching in her hair and not even noticing the sawbriars tearing long gashes in her legs. Gasping, sobbing, Susan struggled along, making so much noise herself that at first she didn't hear the bells ringing. "Get on, Old Red," Douglas yelled, as Old Red stopped and bellowed to let her calf know she was coming. "Dad!" Susan called to her dad, but her throat was constricted by a sob. Even the sob wouldn't come out loud enough to be heard any distance. Through the bushes, she could see the cows running along the path above. Her dad was striding swiftly along behind the cattle. Then, as Susan gave up hope of making her dad hear her, Douglas stopped, cupped his hands to his mouth, and yelled, "Susan! Bert!" He turned and looked in every direction before moving on. Now was the time to call. Susan stood up and put her hands to her mouth and tried to yell, but Susan could only make a soft moaning sound before she began scrambling up through the bushes. Douglas was alert for any sound or movement in the underbrush. He heard a noise on the hill below him, and seeing movement in the bushes, he abandoned the path and came bounding down the hill. He stopped as he saw the wet, dirty girl standing with tears running down her face. "Susan, what's wrong?" Douglas asked as he stooped and laid a hand gently on Susan's shoulder. But Susan, with a sympathetic audience near at hand, broke into violent sobbing. Douglas, ignoring the wet, dirty dress, sat down beside Susan and pulled her close, letting her cry on his shoulder. "What is it, Susan?" Douglas interrupted her sobs, and then, after looking around, continued, "Where's Bert?" That, too, remembering her frustration at not being able to untie Bert, on top of her fear at being left all alone, Susan sobbed and sobbed. Thoroughly alarmed, Douglas forced himself to be calm as he waited for the crying to subside. He gently patted Susan's head as it lay on his shoulder and held her close in his arms. And that's the end of chapter 14.